Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you to all the attendees for taking an hour out of your day to listen to this webinar. And we're looking forward to your questions at the end. I'm also very grateful to TSAE for having me and being a part of this webinar series that they're putting together. So the reason that I came up with this webinar topic is in working with a lot of associations, we see strategic plans being developed that might be 5, 7, or even 10 goals. And really they formulate more of a business plan than they do a strategic plan. And so my hope is to be able to go through 3 sections here that explores the landscape, currently what's going on in the world, and then diving into looking at some of the realities facing associations, and then break out 4 strategies that we're helping clients with that you can consider for your association. And again, this is designed to give you some ideas around big strategic moves that you can make in the coming years. So as we look at the landscape and we compare the trends that were happening before COVID-19 started, and those trends are still all relevant today. But what COVID-19 did was strap a rocket to those, and the pace of change and transformation that's been driven on account of COVID-19 has been at an exponential pace. And so, you know, I truly understand the position leaders are in out there and the world that they're facing, which is ever evolving so rapidly. But given that landscape and that disruption and all kind of the chaos that's going on, there's quite a bit of opportunity. So to set a little context for everybody on the webinar, the content that we are going to go through and talk about today really is derived from all the nonprofits that we work with. And we are in the 4 main nonprofit spaces of associations, which are your 501c6s, higher ed, colleges and universities, which actually have a lot of similar trends and disruptions happening that associations do, as well as in healthcare and human services. And all the trends that we're seeing across the board here are impacting all of these sectors. So let's talk about what some of those trends are as we look at this landscape here. The first is market consolidation. So the pace of mergers and affiliations and partnerships is moving at light speed. I would say it was probably a trend over the past couple of years where we started to see a lot in human services. We even saw some in higher education, and we're starting to see a lot more in the world of association. But in the past several months, it's just been an exponential increase in the amount of inquiries that we received, as well as the pace of organizations considering this as a strategy. The other one is the advancements in technology. We know that as the pace of change has been dramatically impacted by technology advancements, and we're going to talk a lot about operating in a digital world. And as a result of those technology advancements, the business models are evolving for associations. So the way and manner in which you deliver service and deliver value is radically changing. Before COVID-19, there was probably a big workforce shortage, workforce crisis happening throughout the country, given the unemployment rates. But right now, that's not the case. But the look at talent is really around the future skill set needed, which might be dramatically different. So we're seeing a lot of trends where associations need a specific skill set or type of employee, maybe one that can handle a vastly different or more complex business model. Maybe you're moving from analog to digital marketing capabilities and things like that. So that is a dramatic shift and a dramatic change right now. The other one is the move to the virtual space. You know, as we push into COVID, everyone's remote, everyone's digital. So we're going to talk about what that affords as we go through the webinar. But again, technology advancements are changing the shape of our planet here, and they're also breaking borders and boundaries. So if we look at just the impacts on the banking industry, a small local bank outside of Boston can compete with a large bank in San Francisco through remote banking, peer-to-peer applications, and things of that nature. And also, if we look at the idea that technology is collapsing industry boundaries and industry walls, right? Look at Amazon. There are 25 industries in one technology solution. And technology is also affording our capability to deliver customized services. So with a lot of our clients, we're asking the question, how can you become a technology company that delivers great service versus a service company that has good technology? And that's a radical question because those business models are very different. But as the needs of members shift, which is happening or has happened, right? It's shifting from the traditional focus that you may have had as an association into something else. So let's talk a little bit about what that something else looks like. So as an association operates in a digital world, you're dealing with an exponential pace of change. Things move really quickly, but you're also entering a much larger playing field. Before we were having to deal with maybe specific geographies or staying in our wheelhouse, but now what we're doing is we're moving into a playing field where there are multiple different types of organizations, from associations in our vertical to maybe tangential associations to for-profit companies, in addition to associations competing probably significantly down the road with higher education. So a lot of these new realities are being shaped by the virtual world. So in this next section, we're going to talk about the impacts on geographical boundaries, the transformation that's happening in education, which is incredible, the shift towards being member-centered or delivering at a customized level, the contrast and comparison between strategy for members and strategy for vendors, as well as, what does it mean when we say expanded member need? What does that look like? So let's jump in just real quick and talk about some of these realities. So one of them is that the concept of geography or operating area is gone. Local, state, regional, national, even international associations will all start to compete or partner in more depth with one another. And this is happening now, but is gonna increase at an exponential level because as we enter that digital space, it's one playing field that we're all on now. There's no boundaries, there's no industry, it's just the value proposition that's delivering. So a small association outside Boston, where we're located, can compete with a national association if they have a niche focus and enough of a value proposition. And the members are going to go towards where they get the most value. And so they're going to find an organization, an association that's delivering the value that they need, whether that is current content or whatever that may be. And that's where they're going to spend their dollars, because their selection now is across a much larger playing field. And so as we look at growth and building a strategic plan, and we talk about strategy as a whole, you have to think of how you're going to grow in a bigger world, but also shrinking your focus. Because gone are the days of strategic plans where you have 5 and even 10 goals, right? Those are probably more business plans. The real strategy in terms of crafting what you need to get into the future is probably going to be centered around 1 or 2 major things, because they impact the entire organization, right? Because you'll be competing with other associations, you'll be competing with the for-profit world, you'll even be competing with colleges and universities in certain areas, and education being one of those. Now, education is rapidly changing, and the content that you have now is going to be what makes you relevant in the future. If you think about a retail company that just opens its doors today online, nobody knows it exists. So how do you market a retail organization in a digital space? It's going to be advertising and differentiation and being able to compete in that digital space. And the same thing is true of education from an association service standpoint. And one of the main ways you do that is positioning your content that will allow you to be relevant for the future. And some of that content might be old, out of date. Some of it may not be relevant for the future need of the member. But this is one of those areas where there's rapid transformation, but there's also a significant amount of opportunity. And so when we jump into the next section here, which is another reality shaping the association world, is that there's a demand from members to become more member-centric or to deliver customized services. Now that's in contrast to being a 501c6, which is for the benefit of the industry, right? So you have this dynamic tension that exists between what the members are asking you for, which is this customized level of service, versus what you as an entity are structured to do. And so there's that evolving need that comes from being member-centric, and we're going to build some strategy around that when we get to those examples. The next reality that's happening in the association world that you may or may not be aware of is that there's really two stakeholder groups that exist for associations, two clients, if you will. One is the member group and the other is the vendor. And typically when we're creating strategic plans, or what we have seen from previous strategic plans, is that it's 100%, if not 99% focused on serving the member and giving the members what they need. Well, as we push to a digital space and events maybe, become virtual for the foreseeable future, how are we delivering value to those vendors? We've worked with an organization out of Massachusetts that has a $20 million budget. 19 million of that comes from one event, which they were not able to host this year. And so when you look at that threat to potential revenue sources and partnership opportunities, there needs to be a workaround as to how you engage vendors in a virtual environment, perhaps like today, sponsoring particular content, putting your brand in front of people as it relates to that. So lastly, one of the other realities is the expanding member need. And what we have seen over the past 5 to 15 years is that the needs have totally shifted. And where you used to deliver value might be where your organization is still delivering the same services, but the members' needs have grown. And so what that means is, as their needs grow, but they're not fulfilled by your association, you become less of a priority in their life. One of the complaints that we hear a lot from the boards and the CEOs that we work with is, we don't have enough of our members' C-suite team, the CEOs, the COOs, et cetera, engaged with us or a part of our board. And that's partly because that they're chasing relevance as well as an organization. And in doing so, their needs have expanded, and they're expanding into maybe diversifying their companies or adopting new technology solutions. And they're not getting some of those services from your association. And so that is a huge opportunity to become a higher priority, because if you do what's best, in fulfilling those needs, there's a direct comparison between filling those needs and the priorities that you hold at those organizations. So as we look at some of those realities and then start to shift and realize, okay, well, those are some of the changes and transformations happening in the association world. How do I craft strategy around that? That's not a tactical business plan with incremental growth, right? Or marginal growth. We're looking at real transformational strategy and growth to adopt as part of our plan. And I want to walk you through 4 strategies. And really, this is designed to allow you to be intentional, proactive, strategically responsive in some cases, and prepared to enter a new landscape in that digital world. It's also something that you might be able to bring back to educate the board as well as your senior leadership team on some of these topics. And many of you might be, embarking down some of these roads already. So, kudos if you are. But these are 4 of the big trends that we are working with clients on, whether they are small, mid-size, or even, especially large size. associations. So let's take a look at the 4. So the first, as we had mentioned before, let's cover a little bit more detail here, is education. All right, so education is rapidly changing, and we talked about content being what makes you relevant for the future. And so there's 2 levers here for competing in an education strategy, and that's going to be content acquisition and content distribution. So if we dive in and we look at the content acquisition side, so content acquisition is going to look from 2 different lenses: internal, what you have inside the organization. You know, do you have subject matter experts on hand? How are you designing it? What's the old curriculum versus the new curriculum? And then what can you source externally? What experts can you go to? Partnerships that you can create to bring in new expertise that's more relevant to the future. So what we're seeing is a lot of associations design content strategy that's based around curriculum design that aligns with skill-based learning. So what does that mean? Designing curriculum that leads to something, whether that is a certification, a badge, an identifying marker, okay? And that might be structured around 1, 2, or even several different types of skills. And so if we think about some of the content competitors out there, LinkedIn Learning is a great example. And if you haven't been on LinkedIn Learning, I highly recommend you check it out. It used to be Linda Learning, and then LinkedIn bought Linda Learning, then Microsoft bought LinkedIn, and there's a significant amount of investment happening in this platform. And it's an incredible tool that allows you to get credentialed and have badges put on your LinkedIn profile. So not only do employers get to search that, but you get to showcase that as part of your resume, or courses or micro credentials or videos that you've watched show up as part of that on your LinkedIn profile. And so when we look at content acquisition, being able to put things together as part of a curriculum will allow you to steer towards specific directions, whether that's a certification or just creating more skilled workforce for the members. All right, so the flip side to this is the distribution. Once you have put together the curriculum and you've developed this content, again, you got to make sure it's relevant for the future and aligning to what the members need. There might be a heavy focus on technology there. You may coordinate that through a learning management system, or you might use external learning management systems like LinkedIn Learning, or even the simple one, YouTube. And so utilizing these external hubs or internal hubs is a great way to push the content out there, obviously, but you're also able to form partnerships. Right? And this is a big one in content distribution, because higher ed is chasing relevance just as associations are, especially as they push into the virtual landscape. And higher ed organizations, colleges and universities, sell degrees, whether that's an undergrad degree or a master's degree. But if you're able to partner with them to create micro-credentialing or certificate programs and things like that that help drive people into their degree programs, right, where you're partnering and maybe co-branding curriculum, not only does that help you from an awareness standpoint of bringing new members into your association right out of college or while they're in college, it also establishes those partnerships. Again, as content is relevant, the more content you have out there, the more distribution platforms and partnerships you have out there, the more your brand will position itself as that expert, just through being in those places and having that third-party validation. So then once you have all this content, either you're working with partners or not, you got to get it out there. And so utilizing marketing channels obviously is going to be critical, and I'm sure everyone's doing this now through social and email, and using your partners as a force multiplier. But the one thing that higher ed does really well that I think associations could dramatically improve is building an enrollment function, right? And maybe you have one and it's called membership or marketing and membership, but directing that to much more of a sales-oriented focus as it relates to education and enrolling people, or co-creating curriculum to save your members training dollars. So if you have a member that invests a lot of money in training their staff, it's an opportunity for you to go and create curriculum on their behalf at either customized for them or, you know, as an aggregate for the industry, and be able to push that out there. That saves them time, money, and capacity. So education is a huge trend. Obviously, in the landscape is really one of the toughest right now in terms of competition, because everything has gone digital with education. Thus, you know, we're here today on a webinar versus in person at an event. And so the other major trend that we're seeing is 501c6 organizations launching consulting services, or launching them as a separate service item, or even as a separate for-profit subsidiary, a separate entity. So one of the reasons that they're doing this is that, you know, the membership model is in decline, and education is becoming a commodity in an extreme competitive environment. And so these organizations are looking for more of that customized value. And a lot of associations have the ability to leverage their expertise so that they can build customized services. And many of you may be doing this now, whether you're doing it in-house or you formed that subsidiary. But I have to warn everybody that it's a dramatically different business model. Starting a consulting company is a phenomenal strategy, because again, it comes back to that dynamic tension between needing customized services and serving the industry. This allows you to service members, whether that's through a separate entity or not, but it also allows you to track data, right? Which then you can aggregate for the benefit of the industry through your customized services. But it's a very different business model than running an association. And that's a hard thing to, it's a hard transformation to get over if you're used to the management model of running an association. It's dramatically different than running a for-profit or even, you know, service line for consulting services. And so I say that so that you go in with just a little bit of an understanding as to the risks associated with that, because in order to drive that change, you may need to have to go out and hire the expertise to help you either build that or even manage it and maybe utilize some of those consulting firms that are already out there to establish that business model in partnership with. So the third big strategy here is around membership. Again, as consulting moves towards customization, as education moves into the digital space, so does membership in terms of customization from the member viewpoint. You know, it's a struggle right now attracting members that are 20 years old, in their 20s and 30s, because they're used to a subscription-based model where they pay for value, and it's almost a menu of services, right? And we've seen this in comparison to, you know, cable TV, right? There were two options. I want the basic package or the movie package, and that was it. You know, I couldn't just select the 5 channels that I wanted from cable and have those. And because of that, streaming was born. And we're seeing that same demand and that same transformation happen with membership. And so the question around membership has been, you know, is the viability of this revenue model sustainable, or do we need to start switching to more of a subscription-based service? And that subscription-based service can balance between individuals and the value that they would get as an individual member and the price affiliated with that, versus a corporation versus you know, the member company, which would have a different set of values and a different pricing model. And so that leads towards those customization categories, and how do you build that out, which is a very in-depth process, but it provides your members with selection when they can build, utilize a subscription model. And I want to, as we talk about membership, I want to just remove the concept of board governance, okay? Because there's a lot of rub here, because usually how governance is structured has to do with types of membership. And so if we just exclude membership from the governance model and just look at membership as a revenue model, moving towards a subscription-based service might increase your volume as well as your revenue, right? But then you would have to figure out the governance piece to membership, or what your governance composition would look like if you were to switch your model. Or does keeping membership in governance make sense, and then moving to a subscription model from a revenue standpoint makes sense? So these are some of the big transformations in strategic planning that we're seeing. The biggest one, as I had mentioned in one of the earlier slides on the top trend that's happening right now across every nonprofit sector, is mergers and affiliations. The pace of mergers and affiliations is through the roof. Organizations are creating partnerships, shared service models, getting acquired, merging, affiliating with other organizations as a means of strategic growth. So as we look at this, let's say you're a $10 million or a $20 million or even up, in terms of size association, and you want to start a new program or expand a service. Well, you might only experience $100,000 to $200,000 in revenue increase, which is marginally small compared to your budget size. So organic growth may not be a viable solution anymore for the size associations that exist. So you're looking at non-organic growth now. And if I'm looking at starting a program, right, that might take me 3 years to get to $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 versus merging or affiliating with another association that might be $5 million in budget, but brings all that capability, well, that's more of a value proposition and probably a better use of your time strategically to look at how you could diversify revenue or even expand revenue or the size of the organization. A lot of associations are moving towards that concept of the one-stop shop, but trying to do that organically is going to be very, very difficult and a very long road. And so what I thought I'd do is just kind of walk you guys through some of the models, the merger model and the affiliation model, because we're seeing so much of this. What's a merger, what's affiliation, what are the benefits and drawbacks of each, and then how do you grow using some of these. And so when we look at a merger, which I'm hoping everybody is familiar with, it's a simple concept that one organization merges with another and one of them is the surviving entity. So typically the larger association would be the surviving entity in this example. And if it's a merger of like-sized organizations, then it becomes more about which has the more complex operations to transfer, and that usually becomes the surviving entity. But the benefits of a merger are you get to achieve those economies of scale, and there's a larger cost savings associated with this type of model than a shared service, a strategic partnership, or even an affiliation. But the commitment level is obviously to the extreme because you are becoming one organization. You are merged at the end. It's no longer two entities, it's one 501c6. But that also results in your ability to standardize policies and procedures a lot quicker. The biggest drawback to mergers is that you have to deal with the three big tough obstacles: brand, board, and leadership. What's the surviving brand? Who's on the surviving board? And who's the surviving leadership team? So if it's a large organization, a $10 million organization merging with a $1 million organization, typically the surviving brand is going to be the larger entity. And you'll probably take a proportion or a percentage of the board members from the smaller one, and then the leadership would stay the same for the larger one, and maybe take a couple of the key leaders of organization number 2, if that's the case. But if it's two like-size organizations, this creates a dynamic tension in the negotiations because you're trying to figure out which brand is going to be the surviving one, which has more equity, do we rebrand, et cetera. And then who's the surviving board? If we have both boards of 18, are we going to combine that and have one board of 36, which might be overwhelming? And then who's going to be the leadership team, the surviving leadership team? So those are some of the big challenges as it relates to mergers. One of the other ones is that the deal time and the integration time tend to take longer. Not necessarily if it's a large organization merging with a small, but two like-sized organizations are probably going to do a little bit more due diligence to get the deal done, and it's going to take longer to integrate because of the size of the operations. And that's not a good or a bad thing. That's just one of the drawbacks is that it does take more time. So being able to absorb and grow that takes that little extra. So unlike a strategic partnership or a shared service model, and even an affiliation, mergers are way too complex for more than two organizations to be at the table. Trying to do a merger between 3 or 4 entities is close to impossible because of the levels of complexity that exist. But the other option, which we're seeing probably utilized much more than mergers, is affiliation. And so a merger, if you look at two organizations coming together, there's one surviving entity. And affiliation is a model healthcare systems use a lot. And it's where one organization, typically the larger, assumes what's called the sole member role or the parent company role. And then the other organization, typically the smaller, assumes the subsidiary role. The benefit here is that you maintain 2 separate entities. So when we look at an affiliation, right, typically both organizations maintain their services like they normally would. But if organization 1 is larger, it's probably going to have a more sophisticated set of back office operations, maybe from HR, finance, IT, marketing, et cetera. And so shifting those functions up into that parent organization allows you to achieve some of those cost savings that you would hope to get in a merger, while maintaining 2 separate entities. So the benefits are you preserve the brand, the board, and the leadership because you keep 2 separate legal entities, which get to maintain their autonomy. And that's key to maintaining your autonomy if you're in 2 different geographies as well, because you might be in 2 locations as 2 separate entities that have dramatically different pay scales. Being an affiliated model allows you to keep those pay scales separate versus if you were merged, you would have to level set the playing field based off the higher pay scale. It's the most dynamic, adaptable, and flexible model, and we'll actually talk about that in terms of how an affiliation can absorb rapid growth in the coming slides. But it is some of the drawbacks is it is slower to achieve those cost savings because you aren't forced to integrate everything. Like in a merger, after the closing, you're working a year, 18 months to integrate not only the cultures, but the operations of the organization. Another drawback is you are restructuring some of the admin functions of the subsidiaries. So organizations, that can be intimidating to them. One of the biggest drawbacks that the subsidiaries face is typically their governance powers are limited in certain areas. That's just because the parent organization would have oversight to things like hiring a CEO, maybe approving budgets, et cetera, big things like that. One of the other challenges is cohesive messaging and branding. So as 2 organizations maintain separate entities but are a part of this affiliated network, and you think of healthcare, it's a great example, right? You have your healthcare system and then all your hospitals here. There's different branding that might exist between the 2, right? So standardizing those over time becomes one of the big challenges. And so as I had mentioned, the affiliation model can absorb rapid growth. And if we look at this concept here as stage 1, meaning 2 organizations come together, they say, we don't want to merge, we want to affiliate, which is as equal of a commitment to merger, meaning you're locked in and there's no backing out. But we don't want to do any integration. We don't want to integrate any of the functions. We just want to rapidly grow the size of our network and bring people in under that subsidiary umbrella. Well, you could look at adding in phase 2, a 3rd organization, a 4th, a 5th, a 6th, and keep going. But some will even, when they reach a critical mass, will create that new company that will assume that parent role and bring that other organization that was originally the parent down as a subsidiary and just function as the administrative house for the network. And so it's, again, you don't have to worry about affiliate integration and the pace of integration. We've seen healthcare providers create an ACO model, which is that parent company, and bring 5 hospitals into the network in 5 years. And so rapid growth, but they didn't do any integration other than a couple, legal functions and medical supply chain. But associations are now starting to use this. And so when you think about the contrast of local, state, regional, and national associations, how they're all going to be competing with each other, right? This is an opportunity to bring them into the conversation to avoid that competition and create a unified network that really is delivering value at scale in a digital world for the members. So the 4 big strategies that we've been working on, to kind of get you looking into the future is education and looking at how you create curriculum-based, skill-based learning and integrate that not only within your LMS platform, but other external platforms and other external providers, so that you position your content to be as in many relevant places as possible, thus positioning you as an expert and blocking competitors from getting to those distribution hubs. And the second is consulting. So launching a consulting business, a consulting service, is a dramatic shift in the business model that you may be used to. And if it is a for-profit subsidiary, there's a lot of things to consider in the way and manner in which that model operates that associations might not be accustomed to. But we've worked with an organization that in 3 years, their consulting business was at $1 million in production. And it's added a significant amount of revenue since then to that association. And it continues to grow and eventually is going to exceed the membership revenue that they bring in. And so the third strategy was membership. And as we, again, balance that need to serve the industry with customization, members want customization. And that comes from the value and customizing the value and being able to kind of cherry pick the things that they want in building that subscription-based model. And then obviously, lastly, as we went through, is the mergers and affiliations. And that's a tool, that's a lever for strategic growth, right? It's not incremental, it's not organic, it's very non-organic growth. But when you look at all of the associations that might be in your vertical or some tangential ones that might be a value add, starting to have those conversations around partnerships and partnership opportunities with them now might bring a significant growth in your network or the size of your organization in the coming 5 years, because those things take time to cultivate, and there's definitely a strategy around how to do that. So I think, we all understand that the pace of change is dramatically overwhelming, and we can all feel it on a daily basis. But as I mentioned before, because of this disruption and the pace of change and how fast everything is moving, there is an incredible amount of opportunity to be able to seize in this market, because we're all in this together. We're all in this from the entire country, the entire world being in the same boat, being impacted in the same way, affords us to start collaborating and consolidating or thinking differently about how we get to big strategic initiatives versus, worry about increasing membership 10% or expanding our portfolio of services, et cetera. It's really about big strategic moves that you can make. Now, these are 4 big things, and I don't encourage anybody to try to embark on all 4 at one time, because again, as you undertake organization-wide change, right, you really want to be only focused on 1 or 2 things, 2 at the max, because it is going to take a lot of capacity, and more importantly, it may take a significant amount of resources or reallocating how your budget is structured when you go to drive after some of these things. So I really appreciate you spending some time with me this afternoon. I wanted to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions, and I'm very grateful to TSAE for having me. And I think Joseph is going to help me with reading some of the questions. But if you have them, please type them. I'm happy to answer as many as I can.
All right. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. We do have one question in the queue, but before we get to that, I would like to remind the attendees that should you have any questions related to the content presented, you can use the Q&A button. That button will launch a box that you can submit questions to. So we do have a question from Brenda. Brenda is asking, there are several other organizations similar to ours serving smaller segments of our overall market. I'm the executive director and have tried to bring up the idea of merging with other organizations with my board, but can't get any traction with them. How can I get them to think differently about this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So boards are one of the biggest barriers, and I've given some in-depth presentations on mergers and affiliations before, and the number one thing is always start by involving your board or start the conversation with your board. And I think one of the things that boards may not understand is the complexities and depth of the landscape change and how that is creating urgency and transformation in the association space, and it's threatening the existence of a lot of associations. And so building that urgency or that that burning platform for them to be able to see this is why we need to embark on this, I think helps them at least get over the hurdle where they might be able to engage in the conversation around mergers and affiliations. And I'd also be delicate with the language, because if many of you have board members from for-profit companies, they think of mergers, right? You go back to the 80s and you think hostile transaction, and usually when we're doing mergers or affiliations or even strategic partnerships in the nonprofit world, the association world, et cetera, it's very collegial. It's not kind of us versus them necessarily from a we're not trying to hide things from you and vice versa. It's less kind of sneaking around like you would, maybe have that stigma around for-profit. And so it's approaching that subject and maybe using more tame language like partnerships. And we want to start exploring collaborations with other organizations and how we diversify and things like that. And these are the tools, right? You can do shared services, and you can do mergers and affiliations, and you can even do management companies. And so, giving them kind of a menu, but saying, listen, I'd like to form a task force or committee, right, to help me get thinking around this. And really what you do is you create what's called a partnership matrix. And that matrix is maybe a list of organizations that you're in touch with, and you build a profile financially of them. Maybe there's, some assets and, cash positions and liabilities, and here's their revenue, here's some expenses, here's the geographical regions or the services that they cover. And then there's a risk scale that you can use as well when you think about the level of knowns versus the unknowns. And typically that comes from, do they operate in the same market as us? Yes or no? Because if they operate in the same market, it's less risk because we know the market. Do they operate in the same services as us? Yes, less risk. All the way over to the other side where new market, new services, higher risk, higher unknowns, right? And then what do you guys need as strategic criteria? And if you involve the board as almost a mini strategic planning session, you get them engaged in saying, we need this for growth, or we need this, and we need this. And you're writing all those things down. And then when you go through that matrix and you go through those organizations, and you start checking boxes, they start to see which one of those lines up to those priorities. So that's an opportunity to engage the board, but you never want to undertake these things in a bubble, regardless of who your board is. You always want to engage them immediately from the start, because they can either be your biggest catalyst to the deal being successful or the strategy being successful, or your biggest obstacle. And typically, whenever I've seen boards be obstacles, it's because they were not engaged from the beginning.
Okay, our next question is from Susan. Can you give some examples of the type of consulting you are seeing associations pursuing?
Sure. So we work in, let's see, we've worked in the financial sector. We've even worked in the retail lumber, print industries, CPA sectors. So what we're seeing is consulting services being shaped to align to more of helping members chase technology, whether that's chasing health tech solutions, fintech solutions, technology adoption. So it's a lot of, as I had gone back before and said that the walls are collapsing and that there's no more industry. And we get that concept in our head that industry doesn't exist anymore and it's just technology. And now what that does is it allows us to see that everything that our members are chasing has to do with automation and technology solutions and integrating CRM systems or ERP systems, or whatever that may be. So they're chasing those things now, but the operations side as an association. So how are you helping them with compliance or adherence to some of the things that they're trying to implement, whether that's from a strategy level or an operations level? So it runs the gambit. A lot of the organizations we're working with, some of them do audits and assessments. Others help them do strategic planning around their core area of expertise. And so this is kind of it's a catch-all, but if you're delivering services now or members are coming to you for any particular reason on a more consistent basis, that might be an area of need that you could build services out for on a customized level. Again, you just want to be cognizant of the of how much revenue you might be making through that, and it's anywhere between 5 to 15% is kind of that trigger where you'd probably want to create a for-profit subsidiary to park that unrelated income down there. So that it minimizes your risk exposure and doesn't jeopardize your C6 status.
All right, our next question is from Don. How are other organizations categorizing their subscription-based membership benefits / services? What if an organization doesn't have a vast array of benefits?
So that depends. If organizations are looking at packaging things, whether that's packaging education solutions or event attendees or things like that, it's usually access to something that they can get on demand, right? That creates the subscription-based learning. So we've seen a lot of subscription models in education and relating to education curriculum. So on the individual level, it gives them access to certain things. And on the corporate level, it gives them access to curriculum-based learning for staff and things like that. But as far as being small, I don't know without a little bit more detail.
Okay, our next question is from Kathy. I have found the flip side, the smaller groups feeling threatened. Do you have suggestions on how to help them view this as collaborative versus competitive?
So smaller, I assume you mean smaller associations. So some of the associations that we work with that are very small are having the discussion at the board to say, should we put ourselves up for acquisition, right? To become a part of a larger entity, but go in with an intentional request, right? So rather than wait until we're in a position where we're in a state of financial emergency or urgency, we are going to be proactive and intentional about creating a strategy that will get us what we want in the deal negotiations, because we're the one bringing all the value to the table and acting. It's a scary world for small organizations, because as the world gets pushed towards technology, it's not cheap, right? And to compete in that landscape and to be able to make those investments is not cheap. And to just pay for some of the talent that exists out there is not cheap. We do a lot in human services in New England, and we work a lot with some of the associations here in New England, but organizations here are being told that they need to be an actual certain revenue size, right, on the providers, on the 501c3 side, just to get government contracts, because they expect a degree of sophistication. And so we're starting to see technology be the cause of that, and that's starting to spill over, obviously, into the association world. As things go more and more digital, either you can create shared services, and maybe rather than merge or affiliate, you can go to some of the larger providers and say, hey, we can't afford this. Can we partner with you in some way, shape, or form? But again, you start those conversations with the board and really get them grounded in reality. I think one of the hardest jobs that I have with any client, with any board, is getting them to agree on what the current situation of their association actually is. So if I bring in an objective view and say, here's what I see the reality of your world is right now after kind of having met with everybody, and that's vastly different than your reality, we have to figure out a way to reconcile that so we're getting on the same playing field. Otherwise, we're both starting out from different perceptions, and that can be very dangerous because a lot of times, if boards or members are used to going to events and kind of being wined and dined, having social interaction, they may not understand, the urgency of the urgency financially, but the landscape that's changing in the association world, right? And again, it doesn't just, hit you all at once. It creeps up, and it's death by 1,000 paper cuts because the competitive landscape is getting so big. So being able to partner with some of those larger organizations, or even mid-sized organizations, or even a bunch of small organizations getting together and say, you do this really well and I do this, and you start to kind of build a strategy that way, because collectively you would be bigger, is definitely an option.
Okay, we have a question from Vito. Are there legal issues to consider in pursuing affiliations? For example, I am a CEO of a medical society. Could we affiliate with a union and offer collective bargaining services to our member physicians who are employed?
Again, with some of the legal stuff as it relates to operations or conflict of interest, I'd have you speak with a lawyer. But when you're looking at subsidiaries, from the affiliation perspective, they do have to be wholly owned, meaning the sole member, that parent organization needs to be the sole member of that subsidiary. Same with this, if you're starting a for-profit entity, it can't have an ownership structure, right? It can't have multiple different owners or investors or things like that. It has to be wholly owned by the parent corporation.
Okay, we have a question from Hetty. We moved from an in-person annual meeting to a virtual one. It was a fantastic experience, really well done. However, the majority of our exhibitors did not stay with us for the virtual meeting. How do we convince exhibitors to move with us embracing the new technology, that a virtual experience is worthwhile?
Yeah, so I think changing the mindset that it's a one and done event. Build them into sponsoring content. So think about your toolbox as the content that you have, and that content could be done at events virtually, or it could be done kind of throughout the year. Don't get hung up on one major event. Expand that across the entire calendar, right? And then look at just YouTube as an example, right? You go on, you watch a video, YouTube's got every how-to out there, right? You watch a video, but there's always an ad. But you can't take advertising in 501c6, but you can take sponsorship, and organizations can sponsor content like this webinar being sponsored today by one of TSAE's vendors. And so building them into the storyline is going to be really important. But if you wait to kind of have that happen once a year, then it's really not paying off for them, because again, in a digital space, seeing their brand or seeing them as a vendor name in a repetitive sense, because we know things take 12 to 18 months from a marketing perspective to resonate with clients or customers or members, you need to build them into the consistent storyline versus kind of a one-stop scenario where it's a 1-day, 2-day event, and we showcase vendors and things like that, because people aren't able to build relationships with them or physically touch them or their products and things like that they might bring to a trade show floor. So if you can engage them in maybe building content around usage of their product or service, enroll that into your LMS system, take some of the content that they have or help them build it and build curriculum around it, so that if you're dealing with equipment or you're dealing with any type of service, that they're providing as the expert the curriculum, but you're getting the benefit from it being on your LMS platform, thus affiliated with your brand, thus third-party validation to your expertise. So I would build that throughout a calendar. I wouldn't do a kind of like a one and done perspective on that.
Okay, Eric, that is our last question in the queue. To our audience,
Wonderful.
We can probably take one more question before we close out today's webinar. So if there is an individual who'd like to ask one last question, please do so. I would like to remind our attendees in the meantime that you can download today's presentation materials by clicking that blue hyperlink I posted. Additionally, you will receive a certificate for CAE credit after the webinar closes today. You'll receive that certificate as a PDF document and an email that I will send you.
And I welcome anyone, my email is here, eric@curtisstrategy.com. If you have additional questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. I know you guys are dealing with a rapidly evolving landscape. So, I'm happy to take any questions that might be on a more specific basis, and I'm very grateful for your participation and being here.
Okay, we did get a comment from Jody. Thank you, Eric. Great job as always. We appreciate working with you.
Thank you, Jody.
Okay, I believe this will conclude today's webinar. Eric, thank you for your presentation, and to our attendees, thank you for your participation. Everybody have a lovely day and be safe out there. Bye-bye.
Thank you.